Hello and good morning and good afternoon and good evening. I'm Nellie Stansbury, Denison Consulting's marketing specialist. I'm very happy to welcome you from around the world to our latest installment of our monthly webinar series. To get started, as I said before, for those of you who haven't yet, if you would test the functionality of the Q&A feature by sharing where in the world you guys are joining us from. Today, we are turning our attention to diversity and inclusion, which you will hear us reference intermittently as D&I, and how D&I initiatives have become essential in conversations about building successful cultures and teams. The recent examples of racial injustice and discrimination, police brutality, and social movements like the Black Lives Matter movement in the US have only amplified the need for these conversations. We also know that these issues are not specific to the United States. Movements to challenge gender inequality, racism, LGBTQ rights, and more are progressing around the globe. Leaders must prioritize the diversity and inclusion and equity practices in their own organizations. This morning's webinar will discuss defining diversity and inclusion in your organization, methods of measuring your current D&I practices, and connecting your D&I vision to aligned actions across your organization. I would like to now introduce our panelists. Joining us today are Valerie, Corey, and Meredith. Valerie is a senior consultant and executive coach at Denison Consulting. She has over 20 years of experience working for Fortune 100 companies in human resources and organizational development. Her experience managing large-scale change initiatives, coupled with her leadership coaching and performance management expertise, contributes to her success in leading companies through their transformational culture efforts. Corey Jackson serves as the consulting manager at Denison. He joined the Denison team after working at the University of Michigan and has experience in teaching, management, hiring processes, and customer support. His role at the company includes handling logistics, presentation development, and financial support for the senior consulting team. Meredith Grzyb is a client success manager at Denison Consulting. She joined the Denison team after working internationally as a buyer in the automotive industry. With a passion for coaching and creating effective processes and teams, she works with our client success team to support clients as they walk through their unique culture transformations. And lastly, I am Nellie Stansbury, a marketing specialist at Denison. I joined Denison in June of this year after working in the nonprofit sector and as a digital marketing consultant. I work closely with every department at Denison to create and promote content that furthers the Denison brand and supports our clients and partners. While many of you are familiar with Denison, I'd like to briefly overview who we are and what we do. Denison Consulting is a firm focused on large-scale culture transformation and leadership development, headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan, with a European office based out of Zurich, Switzerland. Our global reach has allowed us to do work in over 50 countries and to develop diverse research and diagnostics. I'd like to now talk about our mission. Our mission is to improve organizational performance by developing corporate culture and leadership. Our global team of experts uses our set of diagnostic assessments rooted in research to provide transformation services to our clients. Next, I'd like to overview our monthly webinar series, what we've worked on for the past few months and what we have planned for the future. Our monthly webinar series has covered a lot of impactful topics already, and we plan to continue researching and sharing with you in future sessions as well. During our resilience webinars in June and July, we focused on how employees adapted to the disruptions brought on by COVID-19. We leveraged research from our resilience assessment to understand the impact the pandemic had on organizations' people and performance. In August, we turned our attention to organizational leaders and how they have been challenged in today's digital landscape. Our research showed us that both organizations and leaders have had to adapt their beliefs and assumptions about leadership culture, and the work environment throughout this time of crisis. September's webinar discussed digitalization and the impact the pandemic has had on accelerating that process for many organizations. We also highlighted some of the work we've been doing in our consulting practice and our digitalization model and assessment. During today's webinar, we're dedicating our time to the value of diversity and inclusion through the lens of the path to high performance, understanding the connections between diversity and inclusion, methods of measuring your current practices, and connecting your DNI initiative to actionable steps. In November, we will continue this conversation and focus on taking action and sustaining improvement. Before I turn the presentation over to Valerie, I'd like to briefly overview what we'll be talking about today in a little bit more detail. Like I mentioned, we're going to discuss DNI through the lens of our path to high performance, which Valerie will overview in the beginning on the onset. We're going to talk about defining diversity and inclusion on an individual and organizational level and the connections between diversity and inclusion. We'll talk about some examples of the impact beliefs, assumptions, and unconscious biases can have on actions, behaviors, and results. We'll talk about our tools for measuring your current DNI practices, what your organization is doing well, what your current needs are, as well as some demographics and sample reports. And lastly, we'll talk about connecting your vision to action steps across your organization. And at the end, we'll talk briefly about our November webinar, where we're going to be talking about implementing and sustaining improvement, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. While our panelists present today, please do utilize the Q&A function. I'll be monitoring your questions and comments throughout, and we've dedicated a good bit of time at the end of our presentation to answer all of those questions. So please do leverage this opportunity for dialogue. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Valerie.
Great, thank you, Nellie. Hello, everyone. I'm Valerie Thomas, and it's a pleasure. We're all very excited to have this conversation with everyone and look forward to the chats and the questions at the end. But to get us started, what I'd like to share with you is what we've been learning through both research and talking to our clients, specifically with where they're at in their DNI efforts. What have they been focusing in on? And traditionally, organizations have solely focused on hiring practices through the DNI lens. So really focusing on making sure they're attracting and retaining a diverse talent workforce. Some organizations, have focused their efforts on, really building an inclusive workforce. So really focusing in on and narrowing in on what does inclusivity look like for their organization. Others have really been thinking about it through the lens of diversity of thought. So really encouraging diversity of thought within their organization. And then others have explored unconscious bias trainings to really build awareness of what the different perspectives are and the impact those perspectives have on our colleagues. And then given recent events, Nellie touched on this earlier, now more than ever, we are seeing a lot of diversity and inclusion, specifically in taking a stronger stance in this space. And some organizations have really hired DNI experts to come in and help the organization. They've promoted leaders into a DNI part of the organization, so creating that space, an organized effort led by a DNI leader. And then aligning, we've seen some organizations aligning with some of the social movements. So a lot of great effort. All of these things are important and relevant. And this is not an exhaustive list. These are just to start to paint the picture of some of the efforts that we have seen through both our research and talking to clients. Why this is important is our approach is research-based and flexible. So we recognize you may be in several of these areas all at once. You may just be starting out in your DNI efforts. we're going to meet you where you are and really help guide you through that process. And our tool to be able to do that is what we call our Path to High Performance. We're each going to take you through each of these phases in more detail, but just to give you a high-level view, really thinking through the lens of a engagement model to help organize ourselves and your organization around what are the critical components when looking at a change initiative such as DNI efforts. So the first and foremost, we start with defining what is it? What is DNI? What does it mean to us? Have we established the importance from a leadership awareness, commitment, and visibility to the initiative? But really, in that discovery phase is really, why is this important to us? Why is it important now? And what are we going to do? Planning is getting yourselves organized around that. And Corey will take you through some necessary key steps to be thinking about and exploring and putting together some detailed plans to make sure your effort is successful. Meredith will go through diagnosis. What does that look like? And the key thing there is the data collection, really hearing your employees' voice, what diversity and inclusion means to them and how they see it showing up within the organization. I'll take you through how to begin to have honest conversations, both on that data, but also in other areas, unconscious bias conversations, beliefs and assumptions conversations. And then we'll touch on and give you a sneak preview into what action planning can look like as well. And then in November, we'll take you deeper into the Path to High Performance, starting with action planning, following that with implementation and sustainable improvement. So thank you again for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Corey, and he's going to help us understand what does diversity and inclusion mean. So Corey?
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Corey Jackson, and I'm the consulting manager at Denison. So I want to talk to you today about the discovery process in this Path to High Performance and how you can start by defining what DNI means at your organization as a way to strengthen your efforts. Sometimes the term DNI is thrown out and people have a different way of thinking about what you mean by DNI. Some people immediately think race. Some people immediately think other things. So it's important to define what that means to you and in your organization before starting any initiatives. So one thing to point out is that they are two concepts that are closely intertwined. So it's kind of difficult to parse to only do diversity and not do inclusion, and only do inclusion and not do diversity. But at the same time, they are two separate concepts that you want to make sure that you're thinking about correctly. So first, we'll start with diversity. And essentially, a working definition of that is the differences and the demographic composition of groups or organizations. So this can include many characteristics. Just a few is national origin, race, disability, ethnicity, gender, religion, gender identity, social economic status, veteran status, among many. And this is an exhaustive list. There are many more that we could mention. Some organizations are even now thinking of like perspective as a diversity feature. So, but one thing to think about when you're thinking about diversity at your organization is that it's not just one area, and you can really expand what it means to you when you're thinking about that term. So now we're going to talk about inclusion and define that. So inclusion can be defined as the degree to which an employee or person feels that they are an esteemed member of the work group or the organization that they're in. So experiencing treatment that can satisfy their needs for belongingness and uniqueness is something that really makes a person feel like they're included at an organization. And it's important to realize that there's many different ways to experience inclusion. And in a lot of my research in my graduate school program focused on inclusion at college campuses and universities. And you'd be surprised that even people who you might think would feel are feeling included and feeling a part of a group will feel excluded and feel like their voice isn't being heard, that they aren't being accepted into their groups. So just kind of expand what it means to feel included and feel belonging in an organization is important to think about in terms of what that can mean for you. And the quote at the bottom of the screen kind of gets into that as well. It's like, you can have a diverse group of people, but inclusion is being asked to dance. So you want to think about, how are you utilizing your workforce, leveraging your workforce to take advantage of the diversity that you have. And we can move on to the next one. Thank you. And also, when you're thinking about DNI, you want to make sure that you're just defining DNI that makes sense for you and your organization. DNI can mean something different to each individual. And it's important that you define it in a way that best serves your company's needs, values, and missions. Some organizations choose to prioritize diversity more strongly or upfront in their efforts. Other organizations will prioritize inclusion upfront, and some organizations choose to do both in a mixed way. And then other organizations add in a third factor that is called equity. And equity means to ensure that all members have the access to the same opportunities and that there's more equality along the workforce. So another thing is that, as Valerie mentioned earlier, some are inspired by social movements. So they will align with different movements such as BLM or Pride Month or different things to get their DNI initiative started. So however you decide to define DNI at your organizations, you want to make sure that there is a strategy to vocalize that commitment to DNI, both internally and externally, because if that definition isn't strongly heard and represented by everyone, then your initiative is most likely going to fall flat. So once you go through the definition process and discovery phase at your organization, you want to make sure that you have an effective plan to proceed with your efforts. So to ensure that your efforts are effective and sustainable, you want to make sure that you establish a detailed project and communication plan up front. This is going to include things such as roles, the purpose of the initiative, and the desired outcome or the ideal state of that initiative. And then you want to identify and assign roles and accountability to your DNI project team and make sure that everyone knows what they're going to be doing and how to keep that team functioning efficiently. And you also want to make sure that you are connecting the dots between any current DNI initiatives that are going on with what you're trying to accomplish with your new DNI efforts. The next thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you plan your DNI efforts holistically. So instead of just singling in on one area to boost DNI at your organization, such as hiring practices alone, you want to think about how is DNI being represented in a wider scale at your organization. And then finally, you want to make sure that you're ensuring the safety up front for all members of the organization to feel like they can participate and that they can share their perspectives on D&I efforts without fear of reprisals. So that's super important to make sure that everyone is able to have a voice in this and that it's an inclusive process for everyone. So that's just a bit about the discovery and planning phase. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them down and we can expand a bit on a few of these concepts that I've talked about. But right now, I'm going to pass it over to Meredith and she will tell you more about the analysis phase.
Before jumping in over to Meredith and diagnosis, I'd like to just kind of, I think defining it is the first step, defining diversity and inclusion, what it means to you, but then the next step has to be uncovering some of the beliefs and assumptions, unconscious bias that show up within the organization. And part of that is the diagnosis, and Meredith will take you through that. But before we go there, just giving you a simple framework to kind of start from. So these are difficult conversations. They're uncomfortable, they're sensitive. And so using a framework can help guide that conversation. So our framework, culture is made up of beliefs and assumptions. Unconscious biases can be in there as well. And so looking at the beliefs and assumptions, uncovering them, building awareness around how they show up is very important, because those beliefs and assumptions drive a set of behaviors and actions. And that's where a lot of the comfort level it is, and we can potentially offend others in the organization by our actions. And so looking at the actions, and then what are we hoping to achieve? What's the impact of those actions, those behaviors on our results? And in particular, our D&I efforts. So you could put a great strategy, a great plan in place, but if we're not uncovering some of those beliefs that are operating in the environment that may be enabling D&I efforts, and they may be deterring D&I efforts. So it's really helpful. So let me share an example of one belief that might be out there in the organization. The belief that experience is valued. Those who have 20 plus years maybe of experience, that's recognized, that's valued. If that's a belief operating in the organization, the behaviors that tend to show up with that would be less experienced employees are probably not feeling included, they're not heard, their point of view is not invited into the conversation, and ultimately thinking through that D&I lens, we're not going to see the results of really the culture enabling the D&I effort. And more importantly, the results that we're getting are not going to be a diverse result. It will be at that senior level or that most experienced level results. Interesting enough, in addition to that, I see that and I hear the same thought process, but kind of reversed. So I have heard from leaders that have had a ton of experience tell me that I don't feel like I'm being valued by those that I'm mentoring. They're not asking me for my advice. They're not looking to me for learning opportunities. So I don't feel, so some feel that their expertise, their background, their experience isn't valued either. And so if that happens, there's no communication happening, there's no mentoring, there's no learning, there's no growth, and there certainly isn't diversity and inclusion showing up. So that just gives you an example and a framework to be able to be thinking about and exploring, both from an individual perspective as well as how it shows up in the team, and then the overall organizational impact. So one thing I do want to make note of, when we go through and uncover unconscious bias, it's really important to understand that we all have unconscious bias, and that doesn't make us bad people, just people. So part of this is thinking about being curious with yourself, being curious with others, being self-reflective and openness to some of the things that, again, that are driving your thinking and those beliefs and unconscious bias. Even more importantly, understand the impact. And most often it's not intentional, but there is an impact. And so committing to action and letting go of either a belief that's not driving DNI or an unconscious bias is where we need to be focused our attention on. Starts with the individual. We all have to kind of take a look in the mirror and really uncover those. Then we have to think about, from a team perspective, as a collective, what are those beliefs and assumptions, unconscious bias that can show up? And again, reflect, share, own, and commit to action. And then again, looking at the organizational level. So hopefully that starts to paint a clearer picture, again, defining it, but then really uncovering it. And Meredith is going to take us through our tool that helps you assess your baseline. What does diversity and inclusion look like for us? Meredith?
Thank you, Valerie. Yes, thank you. I think something that's been mentioned several times is just the importance of figuring out where you are in this process, figuring out where you are in this conversation. And a really important way to do that is through diagnosis, through asking your employees, where are we at? What are your perceptions of these different topics and of these different themes? I think it's important to keep in mind that you want to ensure, if you're collecting data, that it's systematic and it's segmented, matching where the organization is. Not only that, but your analysis should be robust to create a clear understanding of the current need. You want to focus on the subgroups in the organization rather than just an overall majority, because different groups of people and every individual has a different perception of what is happening in that organization. And it's important that every person is included and has a voice, and that we hear what those perceptions are and how they're being treated and just different people's experiences. Denison believes that Denison has a module that is for diversity and inclusion specifically, and it's a supplementary tool to our Denison Culture Survey. And it measures how effectively an organization not only fosters diversity, a diverse representation of people, but also inclusion, an inclusive and supportive work environment. Something that's helpful when you have an assessment is that it provides a common language to have those honest conversations. So it highlights areas to focus on, but it gives everyone the same baseline of information of, hey, this is how we can talk about X, Y, and Z. You also have the ability to include open-ended questions and analytics and further research and development tools just to dive deeper into that data and really analyze what the data has to say. I think it's important to note as well that it's impossible to parse apart diversity and inclusion and culture. There is a definite link between the two. And looking at both helps not only identify your key risk areas and current perspectives around DNI, but it also helps prioritize your initiatives and give you focus areas and action steps to move forward. So here is an example of our 10 items for our diversity and inclusion module. Just to name a few of the items: even subtle forms of discrimination are not tolerated. Number 6, people with different backgrounds have fair and equal opportunities for promotion. And number 9, leaders are committed to diversity and inclusion as top priorities. When you're talking about collecting data and having any kind of questionnaire or survey, the biggest thing to keep in mind is your demographics, or how are you segmenting the data, how are you looking at the data. And recommended demographics include race and ethnicity, gender, age, sexual orientation, and level. They can either be captured through self-select items at the end of a survey or through a data feed. And a data feed just means that that demographic information is pre-coded into the survey for each individual, so those items will not come up for them to answer. If you choose to have demographic questions in your survey, instructions should be included as to why those demographic questions are being asked. And they should never be required. You should always have the option for prefer not to answer, or the option that they can skip the items, just to help provide confidentiality and to help build trust as well. Including and analyzing results by subgroup reduces the risk of assuming the stance of absolutism and instead favors universalism, which recognizes that the same processes may manifest differently for different groups of people. So as we had said before, making sure that every group is represented and that every voice is heard, and that you're not just looking at the overall majority. Here's an example of what our DNI report could look like depending on your demographics. So for this organization, they chose to have location, tenure, gender, age, and ethnicity. And then you'll see all of the scores under each segment are percentile scores. The darker the color, the higher the score, the lighter the color, the lower the score. And then you'll see each item in the diversity inclusion module on the side. What's important to keep in mind here as you're looking at these results are, where are there differences between the scores and between the subsets or in subgroups. So if we're looking at location, we can see that Washington has had a very different experience than Denver. And the question is why? Why is that? There needs to be some conversations here. And you can look at what really sticks out to me is the percentile score of 2 under people with different backgrounds have fair and equal opportunities for promotion. So that helps give you some context for an honest conversation later on. If you're looking at gender, females have a very different perception than males do on the topic of respect, and that people with different backgrounds are being treated with respect. Why is that? What is causing that perception for females versus males? If you look at age, participants in the ages 70 to 79 have a very different perception than the rest of the organization. And what really stuck out to me is we do a good job of rewarding positive diversity efforts was a 13 as compared to a 99 for ages 19 to 29. That's a big difference, 13 to 99. And that's important to look at as well. And then if you look at ethnicity, Black and African Americans had a very different perspective, a very different experience than the rest of the organization. It's a very different scores, a 2 versus a 93 for Hispanic Latinos, or a 91 in American Indians or Alaskan Natives. Or 2 or more races had a very different experience than Asians did in this organization. I think it's important to keep in mind that, you know, all of us have a different experience, and it's important that every experience is heard, and we're taking the time to have those honest conversations and see how, not only how your culture is linked to your diversity and inclusion efforts, but also, you know, what do those links look like? And that's something Valerie will take us through in a moment here. Before we get to that, there are open-ended questions and items that can be included as well. This is really dependent upon, your items should be based off of where you're at in the organization. So, and where you're at in this process. So for example, let's say that as an organization, you are committing to DNI as a top priority and defining it for your organization. That's where you're at in this process right now. Then questions 1 through 6 could be potential items that you could ask for that could help you dive deeper and get further analysis. An example would be, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you? And how has your organization communicated their stance on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Let's say that you're not necessarily just starting this process, but you're at the point of building specific organizational capabilities. You know, questions 7 through 11 could help you discern more about this area. An example would be, what would support for learning about diversity look like, and what, if any, barriers and obstacles have you encountered based on your race, ethnicity, and gender? And we have other questions for, how are you sustaining these practices that we'll talk about in our next webinar as well. I'd like to invite Valerie to just talk about the links between, the DNI module and culture, and how those help with your honest conversations as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Meredith. At Denison, we believe there is a direct connection between culture and diversity and inclusion. And more importantly, where are the strongest connections? And one that we have found in our research is through the lens of the customer focus, that has the strongest correlation to an organization's ability to encourage and enable diversity and inclusion. So paying attention to that. So that's one of the predictors of improving diversity and inclusion within your environment. But we're offering you to be thinking about and asking these types of questions for you to determine what is the cultural impact, and how do we enable a culture that allows us to reach our desired state of diversity and inclusion. Questions like, has your organization stated in their mission that they will be diverse and inclusive? Corey talked about that earlier in terms of really making a stance and being very clear around your diversity and inclusion efforts, not only defining it, but also really taking a strong stance and making it reflective in your strategy and your mission. Another question to be considering and talking about is, does your organization consider the demographic characteristics of your customer base? And even further, does your work reflect that in the organization's diversity? Does it ensure that diverse perspectives are heard to best deliver to your clients, your customers? What does empowerment look like? Part of the research that you just saw, the data suggests that there isn't a very diverse way of operating in terms of promotions and development and pushing decisions down. So that data can point you to empowerment, to really roll up your sleeves and start to uncover what does that look like for us if we're looking through the lens of diversity and inclusion. Do we need to have diversity and inclusion as a core value? How does that help us enable, again, diversity and inclusive work environment? So those are some things to be thinking about, having conversations around, again, emphasizing there is a cultural impact and a direct connection between culture and diversity and inclusion. So honest conversations, as I mentioned earlier, this is when it gets hard. This is when it's really difficult to be comfortable enough and open enough to have some of these sensitive conversations. The data helps you do that. So when you're looking at the data, let the data guide those conversations. As Meredith mentioned, that's essentially your employee's voice. And it uncovers, especially in the open-ended questions, what are some examples of where we do this well, and where are some opportunities for us to focus even deeper effort in creating that inclusive and diverse environment. Part of honest conversation is, a lot of this is just building awareness. I talked about current beliefs and assumptions that are operating in the work environment. That's what the whole purpose of the honest conversation is all about, is to make sense of that data and to uncover what are those beliefs and assumptions that are operating, those that are serving us well, and those that are going to be getting in our way and not allowing us to be viewed and experience diversity and inclusion within your work environment. When we think about the next step after those conversations, we have to take action. That's one of the strongest messages in all of the research that we have been looking at is it's not just enough to be aware. You have to take action. You have to have that action team that you want to represent diversity and inclusion when you're pulling that team together. So have equal and diverse representation from your workforce. working on these initiatives. Even more importantly, as leaders and as all employees, modeling the desired behaviors by listening to one another, having openness to new perspectives, especially those perspectives that counter your own beliefs. Be curious with yourself, be curious with your colleagues, and be solution-oriented. I can't overemphasize the amount of emphasis on taking action and really eliminating some of those core beliefs that are no longer serving the organization through the lens of diversity and inclusion. And lastly, be courageous and honest. These are difficult conversations, and everybody has to kind of step up and get into that space, and being courageous and honest with your input, provide examples of what's working, what's not working, to ultimately achieve your most diverse and inclusive work environment. We have another tool that we'd like to offer. We use it in a number of ways. It's just a great, easy, yet profound tool that helps to uncover some of those habits, practices, routines, both that enable diversity and inclusion and those that are going to prohibit the organization in moving forward with their diversity and inclusion. So quite simply, it's looking at the things that are good and old, that are things that we want to preserve and strengthen. There's also going to be things that are bad and old, things that we need to let go of, unlearn, leave behind. And then there will, through those conversations, be things that we want to invent and perfect. And then there could be things that, gosh, we tried it 12 months ago, it never grew legs. We might want to just dust it off, rethink and reshape. So hopefully this has been helpful in terms of, one, understanding diversity and inclusion. This is the first conversation of many, and we've enjoyed being with you, and we look forward to Nellie taking us through any of the questions that you might have for us.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you all for all the work you've done on this. I want to highlight some of the events and resources we have coming up in the future. The main one is the continuation of this conversation in our November webinar, which we have tentatively scheduled, pretty sure scheduled for Thursday, November 19th, where we're going to be talking about the rest of the steps in the path to high performance and its connection to DNI. So that would be implementing and sustaining DNI efforts. We also have an upcoming launch of a DNI resource library. We should have details on that coming really soon, but we hope that that will be available to all of you in the coming week or so. And as always, we have an ongoing publication stream of transformed thought articles and research coming from our leadership team and from really all members of the Denison team. So we will keep you posted via social media and email about all of those events and resources. But to turn it over to some questions and answers where we've dedicated a lot of time. First of all, just a housekeeping question. A lot of people have asked if we were going to provide the slides and a recording, and the answer is yes. We will get those to you as soon as possible, hopefully by tomorrow, but keep an eye out for those. And there have been a lot of really wonderful questions, so I think it would be great to turn some time over to those. One, to start us off with, one especially good one was, how can we start to define DNI at our organization, and where should this definition come from? The leadership or a collaborative, crowdsourced version? And I think that all of you can speak to that, but maybe Corey and Valerie want to give a stab at that, and Meredith can jump in if she has any input as well.
Yeah, it really depends on where you are in your DNI journey. If your leadership has a strong emphasis and understanding of the direction they want to take their DNI efforts, it means a lot to have that come from the top. However, if you're just kind of like not really sure where we are in this DNI process and how employees are viewing DNI at the organization, it's also impactful to crowdsource and kind of get a working definition from the ground up in terms of how DNI is being viewed at the organization and how you want to define that. And there are various ways and methods that you can do that. Pulse surveys, other surveys as well, to kind of get a working definition for that at your organization. Valerie, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, Corey, you covered it quite well. You know, the only thing that comes to mind for me is, you know, if you are not sure where to start, maybe just, you know, pulsing and crowdsourcing, what does diversity and inclusion mean? And have that inform the leadership team in terms of defining it. So, and you might have already said that, Corey, but that's the only thing I would add. But great question, thank you.
Another really good question that I think is especially relevant right now is how do you prioritize DNI work amid other crises like the economic crisis or COVID-19? It always seems like DNI is nice to have, but not necessarily essential. That how can we challenge that notion?
I can jump in here, and Corey and Meredith, please feel free to add and jump in. A great question, and it is a struggle. You know, I hear clients all the time, and not just with DNI, but other really important initiatives. Culture comes to mind, leadership development. Sometimes, you know, we can be in that reactionary mode and not necessarily be as thoughtful and mindful of what the organization really needs. So, you know your organization best, but what we know through our research and the work that we've done with clients, making these a priority, even in midst of a pandemic, in the midst of economic downturn, is critically important. And you will see, you know, improved results and help, and you will be surprised how that brings an organization together and allows for growth, and as well as achieving your results. So I guess my long-winded answer is it is critically important, and it is easy to put on the back burner, much like a lot of other things, but it is critically, we feel it's critically important to give it the attention it deserves and to hear the employee voice. Corey, Meredith, anything to add there?
I support that wholeheartedly. I mean, it's directly linked to your culture and the culture of your organization, and that will impact your results. And you know, we have a lot of research that shows how culture impacts even financial results over time, and how you perform as an organization. And this plays a key role in that. So it's very important.
Yeah, and that's the thing I was going to add, is that just practically, and especially during times where there's a social crisis or things like that, you want your organization to be performing as efficiently, as effectively as possible. And when you prioritize efforts such as D&I or culture and work that into what you're doing, you're only strengthening your organization. And when you strengthen your organization, you improve your performance. And when you improve your performance, you make more money and you survive. So it's critical to think about it that way instead of how do I fit this in. It's like, how do we improve our performance during this time that we're dealing with? And culture and D&I have been linked to performance at your organization.
I think that this next question ties pretty well into that previous question. Is can we talk about the differences between genuine inclusion and surface level inclusion? So rather than checking a box and saying that we've, you know, started a D&I initiative and therefore we're good to go, what can we do to actually foster inclusion and make people feel that they belong?
I can jump in here. You know, another critical question, and I think, you know, by taking a stance, being really clear on what you hope to achieve, and, you know, connecting a lot of the efforts to, again, getting results. So being inclusive and really getting different points of view, I think is just part of getting your results every day. So, you know, maybe not thinking of it as a separate activity, but really thinking through the lens of how do we operate to get the most results that we can, and the sense of urgency around it, I guess, is the other thought that comes to mind. I'm not sure if I answered that question. Meredith, Corey, anything to add?
The thing that comes to mind for me is allowing everyone to have a seat at the table in the conversation, and allowing everyone to be included if they want to be, and not forcing people to maybe represent an entire group of people, but to actually give them space if they would like to speak into something, create a safe environment for them to be able to speak into it. And if they don't want to, then it's okay. And just, I think creating a safe environment for different viewpoints is very important.
Meredith, thank you for that. I think, you know, with the best intentions, sometimes inclusiveness can be abruptive and people will get called out, versus, to Meredith's point, inviting them into the conversation and allowing them to share if they want to share. But I think I've seen in organizations, especially now in Zoom, where, and I do this, I think, from time to time, again, best intentions, but if you're not hearing from somebody, we might call them out. And that doesn't feel very genuine, that you really care about my opinion. It might just feel like you're just trying to, you know, kind of check the box in terms of making sure everybody's voice is heard. And that to me doesn't get to the root of what inclusivity is, and really kind of creating that environment. Corey's nodding his head. Anything to add there?
Yeah, I would just say, like, as you're creating that safe environment and people do speak up, you want to make sure that you're actually doing something with what they say and valuing what they say as well, because you sometimes have experiences where you're asked an opinion and it kind of falls flat. It's like, well, you know, probably shouldn't spoke. So very important to make sure that, you know, you actually have a strategy for calling on those individuals and then utilizing their opinions and thoughts as well afterwards.
Yeah, the follow-up, accountability, and action is so critical in terms of really kind of moving the needle here and creating that inclusivity. It's one thing to share and just keep sharing and not seeing any results happening from that sharing. That can get frustrating over time, for sure.
This next question is a little bit more specific. This sort of speaks to, Meredith mentioned the importance of communicating why an organization is asking for demographic information. And do we have any suggestions for how to communicate why an organization is asking for that info?
I think even more important than that is having the demographic questions not be required. I think is of the utmost importance, and really helps people and survey participants feel more that it's a safe environment, that they can share that information if they would like to, but they don't have to. So I think that's the most key part of that. We can follow up with specific instruction dialogue or communications if you would like to include that in an assessment with us. I'm more than happy to provide that resource for you that could be tailored to your organization and into your specific project, but that is something we can help provide.
And I have another, this is a little bit more open-ended, like the earlier questions have been, and I think after this, we're going to wrap up, but any questions that we didn't get to today, we are going to try and follow up with everyone. And if there's a lot of recurring questions, I'm going to put together a Q&A resource list and provide that to all of our attendees. So look out for that if your question didn't get tackled today. This is just the last question that I thought would be really important for us to address. That there's sometimes the idea that you have to have emotional intelligence to go into a conversation about unconscious bias. And while that's true, I think that it's probably more important to be willing to participate in that conversation. And do you guys have any, questions about that, or comments that you want to make about that idea?
Yeah, I would agree, Nellie. I think willingness is the key part of that. I think with anything, it requires learning and the humility to learn and to actually look at your actions and to take a step back and look at, what decisions am I making? How could that be perceived by other people? And so it doesn't require that you be an expert. You have to start where you're at. And so just taking the time to be aware of where you are personally, and then help bring in outside resources to help you learn and get more insight into how to grow and improve. Valerie or Corey, do you want to add anything?
I agree with you, Meredith. I thought you answered and gave it a solid perception there. But I guess for me, it's more around less about emotional intelligence. I think there probably is a connecting point there, but I think that willingness, but I think also creating that environment, that safe environment, and really trying to understand that we're all human and we're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna say things that might offend others, and part of that's just human nature, and it's how we behave afterwards, right? Are we apologizing? Are we trying to make a healthier environment from some of our slip ups and things that we, again, that's what unconscious bias is. So I do think emotional intelligence might have a connection there. Maybe if you have high emotional intelligence, it's easier for you, but I do think creating that openness and vulnerability is key.
Yeah, and I was just thinking that it would make sense to you can buffer the effects of emotional intelligence by having a strong mission and strong core values. And I think that if you kind of promote that at your organization, it won't require so much emotional intelligence to participate in the DNI efforts as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Well, as we're really close to the top of the hour, I think we're going to wrap up. But like I said, if we didn't get to your questions today, we will do our very best to follow up with you and answer them. I'd like to thank Corey, Meredith, and Valerie for joining and their time and energy on this. Super valuable, and very appreciative that our team is having this conversation internally and with all of you. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you guys all so much for joining. I hope you guys stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.